Thanks for having me. And a quick introduction about me. My name is Christos Matskas. I work as an identity specialist. I'm a PM in the dev advocacy team for Microsoft Identity. So I'm a little bit biased towards Microsoft Identity, but we'll talk about identity in general and why you do not want to do your own identities. And obviously, since this is a .NET user group, I want to focus a little bit on the stuff that have recently been released for .NET and how we try to make your lives a lot easier and a lot more fun when it comes to identity, because obviously identity is a very dry and boring subject, and we totally get that. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute at any point. I don't want you to feel that you can interrupt me, or use the chat if you're shy. I don't mind. And Sadie, I think he is in the shower, so just use the chat if you want to. You don't have to use the webcam. Other things that we do in the team as well, obviously, with COVID, many things have changed. And that's my intro. And since we can't get to you guys in person, I remember coming to Sheffield on many occasions to speak to the user group in person and have a beer afterwards. Of course, we can't do this anymore, and we can't fly around. We try to reach developers where they are. And these days we do that via Twitch or user groups or YouTube. So if you know about Twitch, it's a streaming platform. You can join us every Monday and Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific. So that should be 4 p.m. UK time. See, I operate in multiple time zones. And we talk about identity across multiple subjects. We tend to do end-to-end scenarios. Right now, for example, we're building an automation for Azure that you can use your Alexa to go and wipe out your resources if you need to. So let's say you do a demo, or you work on a demo with somebody, and you need to be able to go home and go, like, damn, I forgot to switch off that VM, or I forgot to wipe out my resources. I don't want to pay for them. You can say, hey, Alexa, go and delete my resource group, and we'll do it for you. Or Google Assistant. And for that, there's a little bit of identity there, obviously. So it's an opportunity for us to build these things. Sometimes we do Blazor, sometimes we do ASP.NET Core, sometimes we do Node. So if you are curious about identity, if you ever get stuck with identity and you need someone to help you out live on a show, then feel free to join us. I need to change that slide deck because it says Tuesdays and Thursdays. Obviously, that's from my last talk. It's Mondays and Fridays these days. So you can find us everywhere. We're also on YouTube and what have you. Now, one of the things I would ask if we were in person, and I can still ask it, but it's not the same interaction, is how many of you here in this space, in this virtual room, have deployed your own user database or an identity system for your application? I'll raise my hand. In 2007, I remember clearly as day, I went and deployed my own hashing algorithm. I was storing users and what have you in my own system. I created a CMS, which was operating beautifully. But there's a lot to be desired when you deploy your own identity system, because there are things that go beyond just a simple login and log out. There is password reset, there is account management, there is scalability issues, there is security issues. There are other challenges as well. And as you'll probably see here, quite a few of the companies out there did not get identity right. It's very hard to get identity right when you write your own systems, and we're still seeing every single day somebody being owned. If you ever came across Troy Hunt, I don't know if Troy has ever made it to .NET Sheffield. We had a chance to host him, but he wrote a tool called Have I Been Pwned? So it's a tool that actually retrieves dumps of users that have been compromised by different systems. Right now, and that number has probably been surpassed, but we're at 10 billion hacked accounts across the world. So companies whose name made it here, and probably companies that their name have not made it here, have been compromised. And we do not want you to be one of these people. Also, if you are a simple user that probably log into multiple websites out there, I would encourage you to go and sign up for Have I Been Pwned and get alerts when one of the sites that you used 10 years ago got compromised. So not only do companies get it wrong, but users also get it wrong by using passwords and what have you. And identity in general is very, very hard. And we don't want developers to feel that it's hard. We want developers to fall into the pit of success when it comes to managing users. So where do I work? I work in the Microsoft Identity Platform, we have different flavors for dealing with identity. And as you can see, we have a dedicated team of over 1,500 engineers dealing with an insane amount of data. So just to give you a quick idea, 345 million active users. That means that at least twice a month, these people log into a system. And we do 30 billion daily authentication requests. Just let that sink a little bit. That's an insane amount of billion of requests going into our system, and we scale that for you. So whether you have a solution that has one user per day, or whether you have a system that has tens of thousands of users per second, we will still scale that solution for you. You don't have to worry about how your application is going to scale in terms of managing those users. So imagine Walmart, they need to be able to provide a login interface to their users. They don't want to deploy their own solution. They wouldn't be able to do that. It would be insanely hard. So when it comes to like if your manager comes to you and says, hey, Kevin, I want you to go and create this website, and we want to be able to authenticate users from outside our organization to be able to log in. There are a few things that come to mind, like how am I going to do that? What am I going to use? So for example, can I already use my existing identity system? So if I'm in a company, we probably have a AD or Azure AD. So can I use that with my platform? Funnily enough, interesting fact here, most of the customers that have Office 365, so Word and Office and what have you for their employers, also have an Azure AD tenant, which they're not aware that they do. So when we go to them and say, hey, by the way, why are you using a different provider when you're already paying for, like paying in quotes, you already own an Azure AD tenant? They go like, we didn't even know that. So if you have Office 365 today, you actually have Azure AD can do authentication for free. Next question as a developer will be, how quickly can I get started with authentication? How much documentation is out there? How's the community? Am I using some obscure kind of system, or am I locked into some kind of an environment that I don't want to be locked in? For the languages and tools that you use, is it easy to integrate? Obviously, .NET is first party for us. So from a Microsoft perspective, we want to provide you with the most awesome experience. And I will show you what awesome means in a few seconds or minutes. But let's say you're writing in Ruby, how quickly can you integrate with the identity provider? You want it to be easy as a developer, right? And then finally, what are the out-of-the-box experiences that you get? Multi-factor authentication, super hard to implement yourself. You have to employ a number of different tools, email, SendGrid, what have you, to enable you to do that. One-time passwords, conditional access. Maybe you want some of your employees to be able to access certain parts of your org, but others not. Or you want to have escalation of privilege. So for example, if I'm checking my HR information as an employee, I don't want other people to accidentally bump into my private data. That's an escalation of privilege. So I have to re-authenticate internally, even though I'm logged in, I'm already in the VPN, I still have to do that extra step. That's conditional access. And if somebody tries to access my data from Germany, it makes no sense because they shouldn't be in Germany, they should be in the US. So that gets flagged up in the system as well. These are the things that as a developer, you don't want to have to think about, but you need to implement in your solution. So when it comes to our platform, we give you quite a few things out of the box. Reduce sign-in friction, very little code to implement authentication, authorization, and what have you. And the ability to scale from one user to as many as you want. Access to your organizational data. So if you are using Azure AD, and we'll talk about the different flavors in a second, but if you're using Azure Active Directory, then you also get a slew of APIs and access to either Azure, Graph, so emails, calendar information, OneDrive, SharePoint, what have you, for free. It's part of the integrated platform. IT is very important. So in the past, let's say you had your own identity system that you were integrating with your every single app. Now that comes with a database that you have to manage, and that database usually is a one-to-one mapping for most of the applications. You very rarely spin up like you have one database for all the apps. So I've been in companies where they had 10 different identity databases because they had 10 different systems that were using 10 different backends. So from an IT perspective, it becomes super hard to manage these users across disparate environments. For us, if you're using Azure AD or B2C, your identity IT pros can come, or the security IT pros can come in and manage that from one central location and have full visibility about who's logging in, when they're logging in, where they're logging in from, and apply the appropriate policies. And finally, safeguarding access. The biggest key here when it comes to delegate authentication, something that you delegate to somebody else, like Azure AD in your app, is that you're protecting your apps and you only provide access to the information you need. So as long as you go with the best practices and guided practices, then it means that you get an end-to-end experience, a secure experience to develop, deploy, and run your applications across the board, especially if you're using Azure. And I don't know how many people here use Azure over AWS or Google Cloud. But for us, it's an important element that we give you this kind of an end-to-end experience, especially if you're running on Azure. Now, Identity is a toolkit to integrate identity and authentication, authorization, and various other things, access to APIs and backend securely. But you have to start from somewhere. So from a developer perspective, the first thing you need to do, maybe not always a developer, because not every developer has access to the Azure portal. But let's say you're writing an app. Kevin has been assigned to write an app. Sorry, Kevin, I'm using your name all the time. Maybe James this time is writing the app. And his manager says, you have to go and use Azure AD. So the first thing you need to do is to go and create an app registration. This is you saying into Azure AD, I am going to use you as my identity provider. I'm creating a web app or a desktop app. And this shows intent. Usually there's a one-to-one mapping. So if there's a web app that needs to speak to Azure AD to authenticate users, we have a one-to-one mapping. And that app registration shows the intent. Now you can do that through the Azure portal, through the UI, or you can use programmatic access to Azure AD via the Graph API. You can use PowerShell as well. You can use CLI, whatever you fancy, but it means that you can automate that process and make it part of your CI/CD. With the app registration, the Azure AD component is done. We're done with it. Next, we need to go into our app and decide how we're going to consume, how we're going to implement the authentication. If you are starting today with the Microsoft Identity Platform, if you have greenfield projects, then we provide you with a number of SDKs, a number of libraries for the language of choice. So if you are .NET, obviously, we have Microsoft.identity.web that is built on top of MSL, the Microsoft Authentication Library, that allows your application to speak to Azure AD, to do this kind of a handshake, authenticate users, and get the information back from Azure AD. However, many customers already have OpenID Connect libraries, and since we're fully compliant, you can bring your own library. So in a brownfield project where you have been using some identity provider that is OpenID Connect compliant, you can bring your own libraries across, change the endpoints, and off you go. Easy migration is that. In some situations, you might also want your application to access some additional APIs. That could be Graph, that could be Azure. So imagine your Azure storage sitting somewhere, your SQL database sitting somewhere, your other APIs sitting somewhere in Azure, and you want them to be able to communicate. There's a little bit of configuration there, but we allow you through that system to do it end to end. And now let's talk about the flavors, because I did say that there are a couple of flavors when it comes to Microsoft Identity. Two main ones. One is the Azure AD, which is designed for line of business application or enterprise solutions. So as an employee of Microsoft, I come into Teams, I sign in with my own account, and off you go. I'm ready to go. I can access my internal data. I'm part of the Microsoft org, so I'm logging in with my Microsoft domain. If you are Jet2, then you have the same experience. Jet2 has probably a number of internal apps that they want to give access to their developers. And this is where Azure AD comes in. However, there's this kind of a consumer side of things where I am an indie developer. I'm writing my app, my Xamarin app, and I want some of my users to be able to log in and manage their information. This is where B2C comes in. This is the business to consumer flavor, where I create something that is designed for external customers, external users. Think of Safeway or Walmart or Costco, where they need to provide a way for their customers to authenticate, log in, buy some stuff, check out securely, and go away. This is where B2C comes in. These are not employees of Costco. These are just random people that want to buy stuff from them. So we have Azure AD for line of business. We have B2C for a consumer, like you're designing a website for your cousin, then they need to authenticate users in the forum. B2C is where you need to be. And then there are some slight other flavors like business to business. So I want another business to be able to access my tenant data. So there is a slightly different, but I don't want to confuse you with that. Starting very simple, we have Azure AD and B2C. So internal, external, easy as that. And then they're all built on top of OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. But to be honest, I don't care about frameworks and protocols. You shouldn't care about frameworks and protocols. I don't want you to be an expert in OpenID Connect, and I don't want you to be an expert in OAuth 2. You could be if you want to, but from my perspective, what I want you to do is when you approach the Microsoft Identity Platform, you know exactly how to integrate that into your solution and move on happily to the next task. Because I know identity is one of the myriads of the tasks that you have to do, and I don't want you to spend 3 weeks learning how these things work. So one of the things that we say is come as you are. So we want you to bring your own developer tools, services, and platforms. And I think the next slide actually captures that very, very well. What you see here is nothing like Microsoft. We're talking about Bitbucket, IntelliJ. In fact, we're talking about Rider prior to this launching this one with Kevin. And we work with IntelliJ and the Rider team to bring Azure Identity into the Rider experience. So if you're creating a brand new web app today inside Rider, then you can actually select authentication. It will select Azure AD as the solution or B2C, and will spin up the appropriate templates, which are old. I need to speak to JetBrains to fix it, to use the new ones once they go, because now they're GA. But Python, right? And we don't care about where you're running your solution, whether you're running on AWS, Google Cloud, DigitalOcean, or on-prem. We want to make it accessible to you, and you should be using an identity platform. Hopefully it's Microsoft. And any language, right? It doesn't have to be .NET first, but again, if it is .NET, then it's super awesome and super easy because we are bringing the best experience there. I'm responding to Roman's message. Does anyone know a good .NET Core example with SAML? Like that brings shivers to myself because SAML is like so 2005. But I did write a blog post in my blog about how to use SAML with .NET Core 2.0. Obviously, things have changed a little bit, but a lot of these stuff should still be applicable. So if you go to https://matskas.com and do a search for SAML in Google, you should get something there. And then where are you going to run it? Bare metal, serverless, Kubernetes, we don't care. You need to identify somehow. In fact, you can't touch any of these services. You can't create a solution today without having some kind of identity underpinning these things. It underpins everything. Now, if you are a .NET developer, as I said, then we do give you this, we do give you the super awesome experience and this kind of an end-to-end integration. Whether you're using GitHub to deploy your solutions, or whether you're writing in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, there's managed identity that allows you to speak to services like app service, functions, storage in the backend without you having to manually go and configure identities. And I'll mention managed identities later on as well. And then from the citizen developer or hybrid developer, as they like to call them these days, you have Power Automate, Power Apps, and the Power Platform that taps into that. So if you are operating on top of Azure AD, you get all this for free. That integration comes to you very easily with just acquiring the right tokens and being able to pass them around to communicate with one another. Is there a local emulator for the platform, or is it Azure only? I'm afraid Azure AD is Azure only. It will be super hard to spin up the same kind of infrastructure that we have on a local environment. So I'm afraid that you have to use Azure for now if you want to authenticate, but you can have a test tenant, which you get for free. In fact, if you are a developer today and you want to start playing with Azure AD and Graph, we have this thing called the Microsoft 365 Developer Program, where you sign up for free, and it gives you an Azure AD tenant and dummy data for SharePoint, Graph, calendar email for free. So you don't have to ever pay for it. Is there a local? Yep. So this is like Microsoft 365 makes it super easy to play around without actually playing with your company's data, right? You have a test tenant and you can do whatever you want. Let's see what the next slide is. Okay. So when you build with the Microsoft Identity Platform, what do you get? We have a very simple sign-in process for everything. And we also provide you with single sign-on. So as an employee of the company, if you're writing line of business apps, we make it super easy for the website to spin up, check your logged in account, and then sign you in automatically into your organizational data. Especially if you're using Edge, the way that we have profiles now set up on Edge Chromium allows you to have a company profile that holds your account, and then that account can be used on your websites to single sign-on. We safeguard access to your data and the user's data, so they don't ever have to worry about the data being compromised. If you want to extend the experience and build some rich solutions for your employees, then Graph makes it super easy. Like the other day, I added OneDrive to my solution with a few lines of code. I remember trying to do that 5-6 years ago, and I had to use the OneDrive SDK, and that was an awful experience because it came with its own kind of a login process. And maybe these days, it just becomes super easy to integrate with these things, thanks to Graph. And finally, if you are an enterprise and if you are creating software for other companies as well, we provide you with publisher verification, which means that your app becomes part of a marketplace. Other people can use the app, you can monetize from that, and they can also have the confidence that your app is from where they say they are. So let's say what's Salesforce, right? If you're Salesforce, you want to be available to everyone, then if you go through the Azure Marketplace, you can always make sure that the customers are downloading the right Salesforce app, not some random hacky Salesforce app out there. I think the next one should be a demo because I've been talking for way too long. Right, let's do this. And to do this, I have to say something about Microsoft Identity.web because this is the new evolution of our authentication libraries. So if you, let me just go into Active Directory. I was looking at the samples before. So if we go into, let's go back and back. Where will that take us? There you go, Microsoft Identity.web. If we go into home, so Microsoft Identity.web is the new iteration. It's the new library for authenticating .NET Core 3.1 and later applications into Azure AD. And this is a little bit important because there's a distinction. Anything that has been .NET up until .NET Core 3.1, unfortunately, cannot leverage this library. I don't think there's a plan for us to retrofit unless there's a huge demand out there. So if you feel that this is an important bit, and I suspect that once you see how the library works, you might say, well, I want my .NET Core 2 apps to do it. So .NET Core 3.1 and later allows you to leverage this library. This library has been designed on top of MSAL. So if you ever done authentication with ASP.NET Core before or ASP.NET, you know that there's an ASP.NET Identity, which is a system that allows you to authenticate against Azure AD. So as a user, I come into the website, I authenticate, and now I need to go and access, let's say, Graph or other APIs or what have you. My account has not been authorized to do that. So I had to go and download MSAL, add it to my project, and then re-authenticate against MSAL or pass my token through, and then go and speak to other APIs. And that was a huge pain. So what we did is we unified this kind of identity model. So next time that you do file new project and you add authentication, you should be working with Microsoft Identity.web authentication, which is built on top of MSAL. So you acquire your token, you authorize your users to use the app, and then you're done with it. You don't have to go back to Azure AD to re-authenticate. So we're minimizing the trips, we're minimizing the code that you have to write, and we make your life a lot easier. Microsoft Identity.web G8 a couple of weeks ago, so it's fun. It's actually G8. We are working on adding it into the Visual Studio experience. So when you do file a new project, you should be getting the latest and greatest. But for now, if you want to work with it, you have to do it via the command line. And let's go and see why this is so much fun to use. So let's come out from here. Let's create a new directory. 2. We're here. Let's cd into that directory. And there's a way to do that via the .NET CLI. If we go into our documentation, and if you come into the templates, let me make this bigger as well. I just realized that it's super tiny for you guys, and you might not be able to see it. You'll notice that there are web apps and web APIs, advanced topics as well. But since we want to use the templates, there's a template section. You can here, you can download the templates today. It's 1.1. And then they give you different options for MVC, Razor pages, and anything else you want to use. So in this case, we're going to do auth with single org. We'll copy that across. We'll come into our CLI, paste that here. And this will spin up the right templates for our website. So if I go into code there and spin up code. So I hope everybody can see this one. If not, I'll make it a little bit bigger. Let's look into the code and see what it does, and then we'll run the app as well. So the authentication component, it's actually this single line here. Add authentication. Wait a minute. Did I press the right one? Let's see. Almost feels like this is not the right one, but no, that's Microsoft Identity. Okay, cool. So in startup.cs, I think we're using Microsoft Identity as well. We might have changed the API again, but should be. Yeah, add Microsoft Identity web app. So in here, we have one liner or 2 lines, in fact. I think we can also reduce this to a single line, although we changed it a little bit since the last time I used the API. Yeah, so this is the line. If you want to be a little bit more concise, this one-liner enables Microsoft Identity Web, and here you see add a Microsoft Identity Web authentication. Then we also need to add Microsoft Identity UI, which I think it's also the right one. Add, double checking. Yeah, that's the one. So these 2 lines of code actually make it make the authentication live. 1 line here, 1 line here. Also, we need to make sure that we have user authentication down here, which is not there by default. That's all you need to do in the code. There is also a login parcel, which sits at the top, the login and logout links that you get at the top. The difference here is that it used to be Azure AD, if I remember correctly, or just Identity. Now that this has been renamed to Microsoft Identity. So this is the page that gets presented to you when you log in and when you log out. And they're built into the DLL. So you don't have to go and explicitly build these pages yourself. We made it available as part of the DLL. And there's the last thing that you have to do here is obviously configure your Azure AD settings. This is where I say to Azure AD, hey, I'm going to be using you as my backend. If we jump very quickly to the portal, you notice I already have provisioned an app registration. Let me make this super big so you guys can see this. So if you go into here at the very top, this is my app registration. I configured the authentication to be a web app, right? So we're using web app. You can add more platforms here if you want to, although we don't advise, we tend to advise a one-to-one mapping. So if I have a mobile app and a web app, I want to have different registrations because they might have different permissions and different behaviors. So here I chose the web, which is .NET, Java, and what have you. Then also we have single page apps as well. And then what we only need to configure here is the login page that once I get logged in, Azure AD needs to know where to redirect the users once they're done. Now, this is localhost because I'm testing locally. If you're running in production, you can add multiple URIs over here. So you don't have to just have one, you can have multiple. So as you're testing, you can use this. And as you move to production, you can also have your URI here. make sure you have your ID tokens down there. And you notice that we are using organizational directory only, so only people that are part of my Matskas tenant or Azure AD can log in. And that's all we need to do. From that perspective, the app registration is done. If you ever have questions about, like, have I done it right? Like, is it working okay? We have this integration assistant here, which is in preview. It's super cool. You can say, I have a web app. This one is not calling any other APIs. So have I done the configuration correctly? And it will come here and say, oh, check this out. You have everything you need to do here. Obviously it says, if you're doing, if you want to have a sign out, you might want to configure the logout URL, but that is optional. So if you ever do other things, also we give you information about the implementation and testing and what have you. But this summary is fantastic because you might be missing, say, identity tokens, or you might be missing, if you're calling another API, we'll say, well, you don't have another API configured here, so you're missing these things. So that's all good. It seems that everything should be okay. And now we can go back into my, let me just split them in two so we can do them side by side. So if I need to configure my web app now, I need to add this. Let me hide that. So the instance is correct. The domain is different. So my domain is, if I go into overview, should be able to see that here. If not, then we can grab it from my endpoints. So in the endpoints, you'll notice that I have, it doesn't have it here. Huh. But I know that my domain is Matskas at, so it's Matskas. So it's my own test tenant I got from Office 365 developer program. And you can have a custom domain name, right? So it could be jet2.com here. You don't have to have that. My tenant ID is provided for me here. So we directory tenant, just to confuse people. Trying to be inconsistent in our naming. And finally, my application ID is this one. There you go. Since this is a brand new app and I haven't changed anything, we know that it's going to be running at port 5000. And if I go into my authentication, you'll notice that I have localhost 5000 and 5001, so HTTP and HTTPS. And this is the default setup. So let me save this one here, not that one, cancel that, save here and save here. And all I have to do now is kick it off. So I could come here and say .NET run, or I could be using my my ID to run it. Is VS Code an ID? Right. Someone is asking here, is there, if you're creating multiple microservices for the same application, would that be one application or multiple applications? That would be one application. Well, if you're having multiple microservices, then you're passing the tokens, right? So I assume you have a front end that can be running on multiple containers or microservices. So that front end should be using the same app registration. But if you have an API or APIs that get called, so let's say a basket API that you check out, and you have an email API, then these are different APIs with different permissions. You'll be having different app registrations for these, because the checkout API probably doesn't need to speak to anything else. But if you have an email API, it may need to speak to your Office 365 tenant to be able to send emails. So you can see that you have different permissions. Did you put by chance the same value for tenant ID and client ID? Did I do that? Maybe I didn't copy paste properly. Let me double check. Ha, good catch, sir. Well done, Sebastian. So directory is there and the client ID is here. Thank you. Good catch. So let's save that and kick off the. And then we'll navigate to 5000 or 5001, and then it should prompt me for authentication if everything has worked as expected. In fact, it won't let me do anything else. It will take me to my authentication page. So the way that the application is set up right now, it requires authentication up front, but you could have an index page that people can come in and then log in on demand. Now you'll notice that there are a few accounts that I've used in the past. I'm going to use my on Microsoft account. And because I already used my password before, it allowed me to come here and build it. Now, let's say if I sign out, if I totally sign out of that, I'm going to sign out this account so I won't have access to it. And let me grab my password from my tool. I don't know what you guys are using. I use these days, what do I use? I use Bitwarden. Apparently it's a .NET solution written with Xamarin. I did not know that. So let's try to log in again. So if I sign in now, oh, you know what? Let's go back into the app registration because I want to show you what the experience looks like the first time you come in. So if I come here, API permissions. Okay, I've already accepted the permissions here. So if I go into home overview, just want to wipe out the settings here, but users and groups. Let's remove this user. So as you can see, I've already signed in and I have default access. So if we go back to our app and we click on sign in, takes me to my account. Now I'm totally logged out, so I have to do it again. So here, I need to pass my password. Nice big password. Now check this out, next step, multi-factor authentication. I did not have to configure anything there. My Azure AD tenant had already done this for me. So now I receive a text message, 971869. Press that. Next, I get presented with, yes, I want to sign in. It didn't prompt me for permissions, but it's fine. So this is now, I have access to my permissions if I were to go and change them. Let's do that. Let's go and change my permissions. API permissions. Let's add some graph. Add a permission. Come here. We add some access to my graph. Delegate it. I want to mail. Mailbox settings. No, I want to be mail read. So I want to access my email. Add permissions. That's all I need to do now. So if I sign out, let's sign that user out and then go back in. Any questions so far with what we covered? Let me bring the chat up. I forgot, I put it behind the scenes. Where is my chat? Okay, let's put the password there and I'll bring the chat up. Another code. Multi-factor authentication for the win. Yes. Huh. I changed the permissions. Super weird. Okay. Maybe it's been cast. So so far, we've seen how we can authenticate apps, right? So super easy. If we were to create an API, it will be the same experience. There is a template in our portal. Let's see if we go here in a very similar way. Now, APIs are slightly different because obviously you have different things you do. You don't have a user interface to authenticate users. You accept a token, an incoming token with a request. So let's see how you will build that. If we go to our API templates, let's grab this one. Where is it? There, single org. And come here. And here I'm going to create a single org API with the new templates. And we will open it in a second just to see what the differences are. So code, open this one, open this beauty. So let's make it big. Now what do we have here? We have configuration. I want to remove that one. Interesting. We use the long-winded setup. So Microsoft. Yes. Just making sure we have the ident.web there. There's no ident.web.ui, obviously, because we don't need that. But Microsoft Web API authentication. That seems super simple. So here we can say configuration, passing the default settings. But there are a couple of other things that we can do as well. So usually APIs can speak to the backend, maybe storage, but sometimes APIs are becoming proxies to other APIs where you need to have different permissions. So let's assume that this API becomes a proxy to our graph. We don't want our front end to call graph. So in that instance, we would use the API to become the proxy to our graph and maybe do some permission manipulation, some authorization there. So we can have different users being able to do different things based on roles. So in that case, we can enable the token acquisition for downstream APIs. Somebody asked me the other day, why is it called downstream and not upstream? I was like, I don't know. Call it upstream if you want to, but we came up with this kind of the downstream API is another API that we have to call later on. This one obviously can take some permission, some configuration if you want to, but right now we're saying that if somebody comes with an access token here and they need to also call graph, this will force the token acquisition for that API without you having to do any extra work. And then obviously, since we're calling that, we also want to have a cache, because if we're going to be calling graph all the time, we don't want to be going back to Azure AD all the time and getting that permission coming back and forth. So we can cache it locally. So we can use that on demand. So in this case here, we have distributed token caches. If you're running in a highly scalable environment, you can have in-memory token caches if you're running in development and you want to make it super easy. And then you can have session token caches, whatever you decide to do. Now, one of the things that we added recently that was not there is the ability to create a downstream API that becomes part of the service, and you can dependency inject that downstream API into your controllers. So we could create something called my custom downstream API. So that's an API I run somewhere else. And then every time we need to call that, we would inject the API and do the call without having to authenticate or acquire tokens or what have you. So it becomes super easy to have multiple named services there or APIs that you can call as well. There's also an extra NuGet package called Microsoft.ident.web.graph that allows you to also dependency inject graph. So if we were using that one, further down here, so let's say in-memory caches, right? And then let's close that here, and then I could do services.add Microsoft Graph, I think, add graph or Microsoft Graph, can't remember the exact naming, and that allows you to automatically get the graph as a dependency injection, and you don't have to go and create custom handlers for the messages. You don't have to pass the bearer tokens to those APIs. Again, making it super simple. From an implementation perspective, that's all you're going to do in the middleware. If you are going to use it inside your solutions, so in here, we have a controller called weather forecast. Now let's assume that we see it's already configured with authorized, but down here, check out this one-liner. If you ever had to take a token and go back to the identity provider, validate the token, get the claims, make sure that the user has the right scope, then that was at least 20 lines of code. Not fun, and you have to roll it out yourself. Here, we made it a one-liner, which means that by using this one, you say, hey, make sure that the user has the right scopes for this call, and it will validate for you, and it will throw a 403 if the user is not authorized to access this. So it might be authenticated, but authorized to access this API because they're lacking the right scopes. So let's say if they were looking to be able to enumerate directories and we didn't add it to the permissions or the scopes, then that token will not include that scope, and it will be rejected as a call. So you don't have to write custom code there to do the authentication authorization. So from start to end, as you can see, we have 5 lines of code, a couple of NuGet packages, and some configuration which is consistent. People might say, well, that's not a big deal. I mean, fine, and we could do it before. So if I jump to another solution down here, this is an old implementation of validating incoming APIs using OpenID Connect. So this is your rolling out your artisan free identity.web solution to authenticate and validate incoming tokens. So let's check how much code is here and how much you can replace with a one-liner, right? So we start at line 32, and if I scroll all the way down to further down, there you go, line 127. I can replace all that with a single call, services.add Microsoft. Obviously, this one does not have the Microsoft identity.web as an inget package, but we took 90 lines of code and we're compressing it to 2 lines of code. Maybe 4 if you need to do some custom event handling of the token creation or at the time of the token creation. But if you're listening to OpenID Connect events. From my perspective, if you are a .NET developer today and can move to .NET Core 3.1, then you should be leveraging this library. It makes your life so much easier. It unifies everything under MSAL, so you don't have to worry about going back and forth. And I love it. It's a great library, probably the best one. It's so good actually that, man, I'm missing the chat. Usually people go like, this is amazing, I want to get it now. Where's my chat? Where's my chat? Because I don't know if you guys have asked any questions. I'm not seeing them. I hate it. You minimize something on Zoom and then you can't find it. Where's my chat? Sorry guys, I'm a Zoom newbie. So, oh, there you go, chat, one message. Where's the custom login page we saw earlier? Oh, for APIs, you don't have custom login pages. And for the web apps, if you are looking at web apps, then we are here. Is that the one? Yes, here, that's not the one. Let me find the right one. It should be here. There you go. In here, if you go into let me maximize this one. There, boom. Inside your shared pages, there's a login parcel. This was always there. The login parcel was always there. And in fact, the only thing that changes here is this. Instead of saying Azure AD or Azure AD B2C or identity, I can't remember what the old one was. It just says Microsoft Identity. So it knows where to point the users to. You don't have to do anything. You can still create custom pages for web apps if you want to, change the UI a little bit or add some more support. But usually it's just whatever is out of the box and you get started. .NET developers have it so easy these days, so well, in fact, that the team has started working on creating the same kind of experience for Node and Python and Java, because we want developers to build secure apps without having to think about too much. 5 lines of code, all it took to create an end-to-end secure solution in .NET Core. I want to do the same for Java. I want to do the same for Node developers. So this is what the team is focusing on these days. And if you have any feedback, then feel free to do so. You can start today by going into either NuGet, as I said, it's GA, so you don't have to go to preview stuff, or you can come into the graph, into the documentation. We're in the process of moving everything into the docs, but since it was a side project, if you want to call it, for a year, most of the docs are still here. And we have a way large number of samples that allow you to access different scenarios. So if I go to the samples, takes me to a new location. And for web apps, it's like, what do you want to do? Simple sign in, maybe sign in and call graph, or sign in and call multiple web APIs. Some custom storage, Azure storage for calling Azure AD, calling Azure services rather than APIs and graph. So everything that you need to look into here on GitHub. Can you replace the Microsoft login screen with your own? No. This is technically what you're redirecting people to the Azure AD tenant, right? So this is what we call delegate authentication. You're not running inside your app. Your app redirects the user to Azure AD. Azure AD, you can configure or change the organizational Azure AD, or if you're using B2C. So what I haven't mentioned yet is that the exact same library works for B2C as well. And in B2C, you have a lot more control in making the login page look and feel as consistent as your app. So you can change the HTML and the CSS to look part of your app. So if you're creating a mobile app, you don't want people to feel like they're leaving the app and coming back. You can actually create that some kind of a filling. But yeah, can people sign up when they're not part of your Azure AD? Now, if you have an Azure AD tenant and you're not creating a line of business app, there's this thing called external identities, which means that as an Azure AD IT manager, you can decide whether people with Facebook and Google and Twitter can log into your organizational tenant and sign in to your tenant using their external identities, hence there is the name external identity. And this allows you to do so. But if you're building an app where it's like, I don't know, people want to buy stuff from my store, or I want to have a forum, or I want to have a mobile app that does X, then you need to use business to consumer, Azure AD B2C. And you can, you can brand Azure AD. I think you have to be P1 tier to customize. I double check that. But yeah, you can provide your own company's logo, for example, when you come to the login page. You don't have the standard out of the box one. Right. So we covered the code, which I love because it's just 4 lines of code and makes everything so much easier. Now let's go back into the slides a little bit, and then we can open 2 questions. So what is Microsoft Authenticated? It is the library that is built for .NET Core 3.1 and later. It supports anything that is running on top of ASP.NET Core. So Blazor, gRPC, web apps, APIs, web pages, Razor pages, anything you want. It's built on top of MSAL, so it takes advantage of the fact that you can use that library to go and acquire and manage tokens and pass them on to other APIs or use them in your app as well. And it is OpenID and OAuth 2 compliant. So if you are building with ident.web, you can use it against Azure AD, but you can also bring your own OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 compliant libraries and use our backend. So for other languages like not.NET, you can use the ready packages out there. Oh, my buddy in crime, JP, is joining us. Right. Ways to integrate single sign-on. Obviously, if you are creating line of business apps, then you don't want your users to have to go and log in every single time. What you saw previous in the demo was me using a VM that is not domain joined to authenticate against the test tenant. Hence the reason why we didn't get this single sign-on experience. But if my machine was domain joined to my C Matskas domain, then logging in with that profile would be seamless. So you'll be getting a single sign-on. Yes, we do have SAML integration as well. So if you can't use OpenID Connect or OAuth, then SAML with .NET works absolutely fine. And you also get single sign-on. So if you are creating Xamarin apps, if you are creating iOS and Android native apps, you can use the system browser to authenticate. So as long as your device is joined to AD, and it's in tuned, as we say, then single sign-on works beautifully in there as well. So a seamless experience for your users. Let's progress the slides. I showed you that already. If you are first timer into the Azure AD as well, we do provide you with samples. Now, the samples are not always up to date, so you might get this kind of I don't want to use it for .NET, and I get it right now. But if you are building with Node or other languages, we do give you this kind of out-of-the-box experience. Also, if you are building with .NET prior to .NET Core 3.1, then you also want to use this one. So here we come and say, hey, you're building a single page app. Awesome. What do you need to do? Oh, it's a JavaScript application. Perfect. Let's do JavaScript. Simple. Now check this out. This one will go and actually do the changes necessary into my code to make it work. So if I were to use the sample, I can say make these changes for me. I'm going to be using localhost 3000 since I'm running my Node app locally. So make the updates. It will update my app here as well. And then I can go and download the sample. Simple as that. So let's open this. Let's unzip it somewhere. Do you even know how to unzip, Chris? There you go. And then here. So this is a Node app, right? I'm not a Node developer, so I have no idea what I'm doing. CMD, let's do this. Here I can say npm install. will go and download half the internet for me, obviously, because it's nodes. My partner in crime always likes to say that I'm taking the piece of Node and JavaScript developers, but that's not true. I love JavaScript, and just to prove it, we're doing a Vue.js stream in the next few days. And now all I have to do is just npm start. It's listening on port 3000. So let's navigate and see what happens. So many local hosts. And I can click sign in. Prompts me for authentication. Check this out. I'm already signed in, so it might not even prompt me for a password. Check this out. I'm being prompted now for reading my profile, which is great. These are the permissions I'm expecting to see. I will accept this one. And lo and behold, we're signed in. In fact, I think it's provisioned, so see profile, perfect, and read my emails. See, this is incremental consent now. So even though we're running as a single page app, it also says, hey, by the way, you haven't accepted or you haven't consented to reading your emails before. Remember, we changed it before. So now you have to go and request that extra permission. So now it provisions that, and I need to give consent, obviously. So this one is now also going to read my emails, and I can say accept. It should bring back some junky emails I have on. This is my test tenant, by the way. So check this out. I don't have to write any emailed samples or whatever. It brings them forward for me, which is fantastic. And so many changes. Brilliant. There you go. So if you are getting started and you don't know where to get started, this quick sample will configure things for you, and we'll do stuff depending on which app you're running. So overview, let's see, quick start. You can change here. You can have an iOS app. You can have daemon apps in Python, .NET Core, what have you. So it's a great way to get started if you've never done it before. Let's go back to the slides quickly and see if there are any more questions. No questions in the chat. So bring your own language. There you go. We provide you with the best libraries out there. MSAL is maintained and designed by us, so we want to make sure that you have the latest and greatest. So as an example, in the past, we had MSAL.js 1.x, which had to use implicit flow, which meant they had to have a client secret somewhere in your code. We didn't want that because we want people to be secure. So we moved to MSAL.js 2.0 with PXE support, PKC. It's not a PXE with a XIE, as I was looking for it I think it was the second day I joined the division, and everybody was like, Angular.js 2.0 with PXE. I was like, what the hell is PXE? Anyway, it's a PKC, so it's a public key certificate authority or whatever. So it allows you to be more secure. And I should know this term, by the way, so apologies for that. But when you migrate from MSAL.js to 1.x to 2.x, you don't have to change the code at all. We make it super seamless for you to be more secure by eliminating the implicit flow without you having to change anything in your code. So it's secure by default, yeah. Applications using MSAL are secure by default. And because everything is managed by the Azure AD IT team, then they can enforce these compliances across the board. And with Graph and Azure, you can build better experiences. I'm going to jump into Graph very quickly. I don't know how many people out there use Graph, and to be honest, I didn't use Graph. In fact, I used to confuse GraphQL with MS Graph. I was like, what? I couldn't understand the difference until I joined the division. So for those of you that haven't used Graph before, we have this thing called the Graph Explorer. It's like a playground for playing with Graph. So aka.ms GE. It's the Graph Explorer, and this is where you can come in and see what kind of data you have access to. So I don't know if it's going to chime in. So there you go. It said, oh, you're not authenticated. Now you're authenticated with your account. I can change that. I can be somebody else. And here I can go and very quickly see how Graph works. So we have both flavors. We have the 1.0 and the beta. The beta is where we push all the latest changes. So if you want to test newer APIs, you can come and play with the beta. It shows me what the call should be. So in this case, I'm pulling data for myself. Now, difference, right? If I go to beta and do the exact same query, there's a lot more data here. So maybe I want to use the beta one because it provides me with more information. And this one does all the calls for me, which I love it. Also, it provides you with code snippets. So if you like, hey, how do I do this in C#? You can use the Graph SDK, and then you can come here and copy the code and add it to your application. You can do some really complex things like my mail. The one I like to do is people, I think, down here. We have a nice API. Yeah, this one. People I work with. So for example, if I were to, I'm not working with everyone, apparently. I'm super quiet in this org. But when we run this inside our Microsoft tenant, it's all over the place. Every time I go to send an email, I will say, hey, these are the people I usually work with. Do you want to send an email to them? So it makes my experience a lot more concise. Hey, you're going to share this document. These are the people you usually share documents with. Do you want to send to them? Yes. So Graph makes this kind of a very rich experience to build experiences for your users and make it a lot more productive for them to interact with organizational data. It's available only for Azure AD, so no B2C for you, B2C friends. Sorry if you feel left out, but it's organizational data. So Graph Explorer is a fantastic place to be if you want to get started with this. Then all you have to do is just download the Graph SDK. Microsoft Identity.web makes it super easy to integrate the Graph SDK as well, so it will pull it for you via the NuGet packets. And then you can write all these super rich experiences and extend it for your needs. The other thing I want to cover with Identity is obviously you are developers and you care about the security of your users, the security of your apps. So if we say, I'm going to create a web app that is going to call into SQL Server, or it's going to call into storage. In the past, you had to use a key, you had to use a connection string, you had to use something to connect you to that service. If you haven't heard about this before, then Azure Managed Identity is one of these things that runs on top of the Azure AD platform. It's seamless to use. So if you're spinning up a web app, you can create a service principal. It will create a managed identity for you. And then you give that managed identity permissions to go and speak to other services. So you can say, I have a web app that needs to speak to my SQL Server. I'm going to use this managed identity to allow me to speak to SQL Server without having any keys, no connection strings. We'll have limited permissions to do certain things like reader stuff only inside SQL. I can provide RBAC permissions to that as well. And then that's account is tied to these two services alone. So even if somebody were to compromise that identity, they won't have access to anything else. Managed identities also make it super easy and super seamless to work as a developer inside your own development environment. So if I were creating that same web app, I had to test it locally before I push it to the production environment. Locally, we have a tool or tools to allow you to authenticate against those same services in order for you to be able to authenticate on your local machine against the Azure service without providing any keys or any dependencies on Key Vault or what have you. So that makes it super secure and super easy to integrate with multiple services inside Azure. This is an added benefit, obviously. So if you're running on AWS, you don't get the same kind of luxury. But for us, making first-class tools and services and languages work seamlessly, it's a great experience. The Azure SDKs, if you are working with the Azure SDKs, this is how you would get access to your managed identities in code, aka.ms. And I can share these links afterwards as well, folks. So aka.ms is AZ SDKs. And apologies for the confusion, but we have two flavors right now, side by side. So if you are looking into Azure and working with Azure in your code, you come here and you get the latest of the best breed out there for you, the language of choice. So you can see in .NET, we have the client libraries, the data plane, the consumer libraries. So, if you're working with, let's say, cognitive services, or there's obviously the identity one that does the authentication for management and what have you, Key Vault, Service Bus. These are the libraries that you have to use here, and we provide docs and samples. So everything you need to find. But again, it's one of these things that touches the Microsoft Identity platform across the board, and you don't have to think about it. It just happens. It's there and works beautifully for you. See, JP is answering questions. He's on fire. Thank you, JP, my partner in crime. So we cover these. Let's go down. Oh, I think that was the second last slide. Interesting. How far did we go? Doesn't make sense. So I've jumped a little bit ahead when it comes to ident.web because I want to show you the demos and I want you to kill you with PowerPoint. But as you can see, if Marcia can do it, everybody can. And some comparisons between the old and the new ways for doing authentication with the Microsoft Ident.web, but I show that in action. So hopefully you got a nice taste of why you should be using the latest libraries, not the older ones, at least when you can do it with 3.1 and later. We make it super easy for both APIs and web apps to leverage the identity system and create secure solutions. So if people are asking where does it fit in the whole space, you can still use the independent components here. So you can still have your OpenID Connect authentication. These libraries are still there and you can still use them. You can still do your JWT authentication or JWT because JWT is not a word or the way to pronounce JWT. And you can have these individual components. You don't have to use ident.web, but from my perspective, if you can use ident.web, then why fall back into the old ways? But it is built on top of all these components. So we just abstracted the complexities for you, and we try to make it easy and simple to get started with secure web apps. And again, all hat, new hats. We've seen this in actions. And we've done this before, and a couple of points there for Graph. You can build custom solutions. You can use Graph to automate things. You can use Graph to enrich user experiences. It brings a lot of organizational data to the forefront with very few lines of code and with some super advanced filtering and what have you. And in effect, we allow you to do all this, or we want to encourage you to do all this to make it more personal to your users to use their apps or your apps, your line of business applications. You can see you can use it in anything, even HoloLens and daemon apps. So it doesn't have to be just one. We have people have built amazing portals or amazing dashboards using Graph and Power Apps. And I think that's we've done the Graph Explorer. We talked about B2C. Again, to reiterate, B2C is the option if you want to have external users coming into your app. So, you're building a web app, you're building a mobile app, you're building a game, you need to authenticate users and manage their accounts. This is the solution for you. And again, it has the same scalability, the same engine for you to do. It's more customizable, obviously, because it's addressed to consumers. So you want to bring that experience in. And I think that's us. Right. So yeah, for B2C, you also bring external identities, as I mentioned. And yeah, so if you want to catch us live, if you want to see us in action, as we build these things, as we explore new frameworks, new capabilities, new functionality, we're always on tweets Mondays, and I need to change the slide. Totally forgot about this. Mondays and Fridays, 8 a.m. Pacific time or 4 p.m. UK time. And we also have emails. We're also on Twitter. So Christos Matskas is my Twitter handle. I'll put it on the chat. You can reach out to us anytime that you have questions about identity. Can multitask particularly well. And me and JP will be more than happy to help you out. And that's me.